No preference. I don't want to get away from that side. I'm just, I want to speak this morning on this topic. Now, as it says, being different in a world far from God. I could perhaps have used the word being faithful in a world far from God. Now, Isaac, if you could just click on to the next slide. You might, if you've got a really good memory and you were here 54 weeks ago or that sort of thing, last summer I talked about this guy, Mephibosheth. Now, Mephibosheth, I made the point at the time he's got a really tough name. But it's okay. This time I've got these names. Belteshazzar, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. I've also got Jehoiakim. Let me just check this one. Ashpenaz and Nebuchadnezzar. So please be warned, there's some very interesting names coming up. My advice when you read through the Bible is don't let the names put you off. Particularly there's a place in the Bible where there's a whole long list of names of people maybe involved in the building of the tabernacle. And it goes to this whole long list of people who did these jobs. That's not going to be the most meaningful thing for you as you start off as a Christian to find out about God. It's okay to just go, and then long list of names and on again. And when it comes to if you're standing up and reading in the Bible or you're just reading it to yourself and you come across a difficult name, just go for it. Don't worry about it. Now, there might be someone in the audience who is a scholar and knows ancient Babylonian names. And I might say, well, you did mispronounce that ancient Babylonian name. Well, you're probably the only one in the room who knows that, and maybe just let me off and don't worry about it. So we're going to go through, and we're actually going to read together the first chapter of the book of Daniel. Now, to make it hopefully easy, and also so that you can double check that I'm not saying something wrong, I've got it all up there. In fact, I'm going to turn from you slightly, and I'm going to read it from there. If you've got a Bible, by all means, read along. I've taken this off the internet from the NIV version. Now, whenever you go on the internet, the NIV version is typically Americanized. So they lose a U here and there in words like favour and have other spelling mistakes. But never mind. We'll be okay. If you're following in a different version, I'll still speak clearly and hopefully it'll be all right. So Daniel chapter 1 says this. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure houses of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court's officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men for your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, I thought before we dig too far into this, I just want to give you a little bit of background. You might know that Israel is coming up a lot in the news nowadays, and unfortunately it's always been a place that has had difficulty, has had warfare, has had troubles. Early on, when the Jewish people went into the land of Canaan and they took control of it, they actually separated into 2 kingdoms, a kingdom called Israel and a kingdom called Judah. Israel was the first one to fall. And the sad thing is, as you go through the Old Testament books of 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, you hear of all these kings, and sometimes it says of them, well, this one did the right things in God's eyes. But far too often it said, this king did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And there comes a time when we're back in the book of 2 Kings and we read this. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. But then he turned against Nebuchadnezzar and rebelled. So first off, Nebuchadnezzar comes to the land and basically puts someone in charge and says, look, you're just going to follow my will. But they turn against him. So he comes back later, and I've skipped a few things along here. Jehoiachin, it's not a spelling mistake. That's Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiachin. Rather awkward when dads give their sons the name that's basically the same as theirs. You know, when you say Dave Withers, who do you mean? You know, it can be confusing. And you try and say David and Dave and know which one you mean, but never mind. But anyway, Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. And here we go again. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father had done. Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city. Jehoiakim, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered. In the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiakim prisoner. As the Lord had declared, this is familiar from what we've read before, Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace and cut up the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. He carried all Jerusalem into exile, all the officers and fighting men and all the skilled workers and partisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left behind. So just to give you that full context, Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes control for a while and just says, well, let's just have things happening, but you bring me all your taxes, you do all the things that I tell you to. But Jehoiakim, the dad, rebelled. So then Nebuchadnezzar comes back and takes away some of the best and brightest of the land. And I don't know, maybe it was because then he thought, well, if I have all your most clever people, I've got no one to plot against me in Judah because you're all under my control. And so there's not going to be the uprising against me because I've got those who could have been influential. But then finally says, that's enough. You're all coming now, and I will take you all into exile. So this is the backdrop that our story starts in. And when the king says, I want to take all these best and brightest people, Daniel and his 3 friends are part of those people taken. One of the things I find interesting but hard for us to understand nowadays is names in the Bible, even though I've kind of dismissed it a bit and said, oh, don't worry if you can't read them too well, just skip over. The names actually mean some things. Now, Jehoiakim, that dad who was a king and did evil in the eyes of the Lord, he was named Jehovah will establish or raise up. You know, I wonder if his parents were thinking, right, let's make it so that he's named after God and we're invoking the name of God to say, yes, everything's going to be great because God will raise things up. And he kept the tradition going, calling his son Jehovah Establishes. You know, many people today think that we live in a Christian country. And I don't know why they think that. I don't know why they think that we're in a Christian country because that's what our laws were based on. I don't know if they say we're in a Christian country because, you know, that's traditionally where our main faith was. I don't know if they're kind of thinking, well, the thing is, there used to be, you know, used to be a lot of people who went to church, and when you say to people, fill in a form, maybe for your child going to school, and it says religion, they'll naturally write down Christian or Church of England. These leaders were calling on the name of the one true God and saying, look, you're our God, but we're going to act as if you don't even exist. This other king who came against them, his name meant Nebo protects the crown. One of the many gods that they worshipped. He was coming in, he was saying, well, you've got your God, I've got my God who protects me. Just a little background for those of you who think I'm getting a bit boring in what I'm saying. This Nebuchadnezzar, he's the one who they say was responsible for the building of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Because his wife was upset that she was away from her homeland, which was renowned for all its trees and plants and all the rest of it. So he built this in honor of his wife, Amuya. Too many difficult names. But regardless, these two men, coming in the names of their gods, one comes in the name of the true God, but doesn't even acknowledge he exists. The other comes in the name of a false god and does all the violent things and takes control as he sees fit. So we've got these two kings that are setting this story, and then our friend Daniel comes into the story being taken into captivity. Now, as I say, names in the Bible are really, really great. Names that end in L, there's a lot of those, and they refer to God. Israel, God is upright. Joel, the Lord is God. Names that end in Aya refer to Jehovah. Isaiah, Jehovah is salvation. Jeremiah, Jehovah will exalt. And these four men we've been introduced to, their names follow this pattern. Daniel, God is my judge. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious. Mishael, who is like God. Azariah, Yahweh has helped. So these young men who have names that honor God, they behave in ways that honor God as well. I love to kind of picture in my mind's eye these young men when they're kids out playing, and the mum shouts to get their child to come in and shouts out, "Who is like God?" And their little child comes running in. Well, as he's a little boy, maybe he didn't. Maybe he ignored his mum and just kept playing. But every time their name was said, it was basically saying, we're honouring God. You'll notice in the story that there came a point where their names were changed. Now, I come across a lot of children who have taken on different names. So, for example, I've got a lad who I used to teach this year. His actual name is Hayat. But he called himself Hayden, just so that he could take on a name that would fit in and would sound normal. I've got another student whose name was Yu Yan. Now, Yu still wanted to be called Yu. So every so often I would say, Yu, can you answer the question, Yu? Do you know what I'm talking about, Yu? Not quite as bad as the student at one of my previous schools whose name was U-M-A-N, U-Man. And the teacher got told off by the Ofsted inspector for saying, "How are you doing, you man?" And it's like, the Ofsted inspector was like, "You're so casual, why do you call him you man?" And the teacher said, "Well, that is his name. That's why I call him that." But that's not what's happening with these names. It's not that they've chosen these names so that they can integrate, so they can fit in. They've been given these names as a curse. Daniel, God is my judge. No, 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 we're not going to let you say that anymore. We're not going to say God is my judge and acknowledge your God when we talk to you. We're going to call you Baal, Belteshazzar, Baal, protect the king. Every time we say you now, we're going to be acknowledging a different God, a false God. We're not going to mention your God. Hananiah, we're not going to say Yahweh is gracious. We're going to say now you're commanded by Aku. Mishael, we're not going to call you that anymore. We're not going to say who is like God. We're going to say who is like Aku, their moon god. Azariah, we're not going to call you that anymore and say Yahweh has helped. We're going to call you servant of Nebo. We're going to take your names and we're going to give you something that is an offense every time it's said. You know, I was thinking, how could I get this across to you? It's like me turning up somewhere and I say, my name's Steve. And they said, oh, no, we can't understand that name. Your name's Steve, which means crowned. Well, you were given that because your parents liked the name, because they thought about the biblical character Stephen, because they thought it sounded good, and it didn't go weirdly with night, like Kay's idea of having a child called Sky Night, or in the register, Night Sky. And I put my foot down and said, you're not doing that. It would be like me going somewhere and they're saying, we can't say Steve, so we're going to call you Manu. We're going to call you Man United are the best. And every time we talk to you, we're going to say, Man United are the best. I'm going to be like, oh, please don't say that. That's such an insult. You've taken my name that means crowned and you've said Man United instead. If you're a Man United fan, I'm sorry. You should know better. You should pick a better team. But anyway, these names were not just a matter of them saying, you know, your name is a bit easier for us to understand. This was a way of degrading them, of degrading our God. As I say, this was the setting they'd been moved into. They'd been taken away from their country, their family, their culture, their freedom, their religion, and their names. Now, it might sound weird that the first thing we hear about them standing up for is their food. You know, you might have thought, well, of all the battles to have, why would you be worried about what you eat? And sometimes it's hard for us to understand. So if we just look at this, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now, one of the things I definitely don't want you to go away thinking is that the book of Daniel tells us that we should be vegetarians. It doesn't. Please, it's not about that. It might be about these things. Maybe that the food that these important people used to have, because they're getting the royal food, maybe it had been offered to idols. So part of it would have been burned up in the sacrifice to their gods, and then some of the meat could have been taken away and presented to the king, the royal family, and these as the trainees. Maybe the way that the food was prepared wasn't right for them. So I've gone in the wrong order. You know, I just happened to be talking to Becca as I drove her back from the airport about her friends on camp who would only eat halal meat, but the people who made the food on the camp didn't supply halal meat, and they were being made to get their own food because they couldn't have the meat that was there. Maybe the food that was being offered were things that the Bible said, do not eat those things. Those are unclean. And there are still people who hold to those sorts of rules now. I was mentioning again to Becca as we drove that my Uncle Reg had a book way back. I remember him talking to me about it, which was about scientific things that come up in the Bible. If you look at the things that they were told not to eat, they were told not to eat pork. Now, that might sound, you know, okay, why not, etc. If you don't cook pork properly, you're going to get bugs and tapeworms and horrible things. But you can slightly undercook lamb. You can slightly undercook beef. You know, Dad wants it well done. In fact, he wants it char-grilled. But you can have your meat in a slightly less done way, and it's still perfectly good for you. They were told not to eat seafood. I wouldn't eat seafood because I'm allergic to it. But they're told not to eat seafood, and you know that if you don't keep seafood properly, it's going to go bad, you're going to get sick. Maybe it was that where they were told, don't eat this food because it's not right for you as a nation. Now, the point where it says that they got given wine. Often we talk about wine in the Bible, and again, it can cause a bit of confusion, because sometimes it was just grape juice. It was called wine, but it was kind of just saying, well, you're going to have some grape juice because that's going to be better than water that might be slightly polluted. But maybe it was that the Babylonians loved to get drunk, and they had more fortified wine, and they were thinking, no, we've got to keep away from it. As I say, we've got to be clear about this, because Jesus in Matthew 11 says, what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. And he goes on a little further on to say even more. Just see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body. But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what defile a person. But eating with unwashed hands does not defile them. You know, we're not held under the same rules as Daniel was. We're not going to be defiled in the same way by those things that we eat. And Jesus says, no, the standard is this. We've got to make sure that what comes out of us is the right thing. Sorry, I keep switching between my phone and my tablet. I've kind of got the PowerPoint on one, and I've got my sermon notes on the other. So I kind of keep referring between the two to make sure I'm up to the right place. But the question I've got to ask you is, well, what happened as a result of this? Now, we've already said this isn't about being a vegetarian. This isn't about a proper protein diet or whatever it is. But when they were tested, they were found to be healthy. They were found to be nourished. They were found to be doing really well. You know, it does sometimes feel like you might be stretching a point slightly. But this was the standard that was set up for the Babylonians. And it could have been that they could have fallen into eating too much, drinking too much, basically going against all of their rules and therefore not doing so well. But they chose the right path. They chose what God had commanded them. The thing that's interesting, if you kind of read on through the verses, what happens is they don't just pass the test, but it says this. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And then in verse 20, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Their faithfulness didn't just mean that they got to keep the diet they wanted, but God gave them wisdom. God gave them knowledge. God gave them what they needed to rise up and be in an important place so that their lives would be seen as valuable and they would be saved. So we kind of come to the end of the story, and it's only the end of that first chapter. So my apologies, I shouldn't have said to the end of the story. I should have said to the end of the first chapter. And maybe when you think about the book of Daniel and you think about Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, this isn't the story you immediately think of. Maybe you don't think of their diet, but we've got these stories that then follow on. So Daniel is put in a difficult position in chapter 6, where all the people are trying to discredit him and say, well, let's make it so he gets caught out because he keeps praying. In chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, the trap that was laid for them is, would they bow down to a false, couldn't say my word right there, would they bow down to a false idol? And they passed that test. The question really, though, is, I haven't talked about this whole passage just to talk to you about eating and drinking, particularly because it's getting up to lunchtime and you might be a bit fed up of that. The reason why I mention this is, as you follow through the story, we started with people in a land that was named for God, a land where the kings were named in ways that would say that they respected and honoured God, but they were far from it. These young men were then taken to a land that was utterly, utterly opposed to God. And every way they turned, they were faced with temptation. Will you conform to the way Babylon is? Will you conform to the diet they want you to have? Will you conform to the practices that go on there? Every time I talk to you, I'm going to insult you in your name. Every time that, I think about you, I try to trap you and make you look foolish. The sad thing is that this is really the same as the world we live in. Now, if you're not a Christian, the world seems to be going in a certain direction, and it's easier to just follow the flow. It's easier to say, well, I'll just fit in with everyone else because that will make my life easy. But the challenge we're given when we're faced with the Bible is, but what God wants you to do is stand up and say, no, that's not the right thing for me to do. I need to be doing something different. I want you to think either ahead to your week to come or back to the week you've just had. Because maybe the week you've just had was relaxing. You're on holiday. You didn't have too much pressures on you. Maybe the week to come, you have to go back to school. And life changes, and you go from one phase of being to another. What are the challenges that are going to be put in front of you? What are the ways you could be offered to compromise? Is it easier to align with the world and just go along with the flow? Or are you able to be like Daniel? I've got to admit, I find this really strange. I was about to say Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it's like, well, why does Daniel keep using those names? Why doesn't he say, Azariah instead of Abednego? Why doesn't it have the Jewish name that brings honor to God? I've got to say, I don't know why. But are you going to be someone who stands up and says, no, actually, I need to be slightly different? When that person at work says to you, well, do you want to hear this joke I heard? It's a bit rude, it's a bit risque, but do you want to hear it? Or someone says, oh, you won't believe the rumor I've just heard, and wants to spread on a bit of gossip. Are you going to be able to say, no, I don't want to join in, thank you? It's difficult, isn't it? It's difficult to stand out. But I want you to think about the example of these 4 young men who actually stood up and said, no, we're going to do it differently. What was the outcome of that? God gave them wisdom. God gave them respect. God gave them a position because actually they stood up for him and done the right thing. You've seen from these other stories, it doesn't mean their life was easy. It doesn't mean that they risked being put to death. But they followed God. They got wisdom from God. They lived for God. If you're not a Christian, sometimes it might be hard to kind of think, well, why should I? Why should I be different to my friends around me? And all I can say is, because of Jesus. Because of what we're presented in the Bible that says, we had this verse just over a week ago. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. We know the truth. We know the way God wants us to live. We know he's the way to get to heaven. Ultimately, he is the life. He's the one who's going to keep us and hold us for eternity. So as you go through this coming week, I want you to, Christian, think, well, where are the places I could still be taken astray? I could still be tempted to do the wrong thing and say, no, I'm going to be like Daniel. I'm going to say, no, actually, I can't be part of that. Even if it means your reputation goes a bit. If you're not a Christian, I want you to be able to say, well, hang on a sec. If these Christians are willing to put themselves in risk, if they're willing to put themselves at odds to the world, it must be for a reason. They can't all be that stupid. Yeah? Can't be that they're just willing to be awkward and stand out for no reason. It's because we trust in God. It's because we believe in him. Because we have faith that he will keep us and strengthen us and give us the wisdom we need. Let's pray.